Mhm. Okay.
Terrific.
All right. Just wanted to say hello and thank everybody for sharing so much of their Friday with us. I know some folks might not be able to stay through the whole time, but we're happy to have everyone be part of the conversation as much as they can. This is our follow-up to what we did last year, and I'm sure the idea is to continue. So this is all about building connections and putting knowledge together and sharing ideas. So just with that frame of mind. And we've been meeting, I would say, kind of monthly, but gotten a little bit busier in the past few weeks, as you can imagine. So I just want to thank our committee too, Liz, Jen, Jason, Tom, Lisa, Scott, Stephen. I know there are other folks that have been involved, Gretchen, of course, and ASLA in general support as we kind of organize this and get it out there to the group. And I'll keep it short and sweet so we can keep moving. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ellen. And is Jen on the call?
I am. I'm right here.
Wonderful, Jen. Hi.
Hi, I'll just jump in. Hi, everyone. My name's Jen Martell. I'm the president of the New Hampshire chapter of ASLA, and I just want to say hello. I'm really happy to be here and really inspired by the engagement of our region's landscape architects and allies who are all working together to address the shared challenges that climate change has presented us with. In New Hampshire, our communities are really facing, a whole host of issues that I'm sure everyone in the region is facing, but specifically, big hit is loss of winter recreation opportunities that are so important to our culture and economy in New Hampshire, and also really inadequate sustainable transportation infrastructure. And we're also experiencing significant coastal impacts, especially ecological deterioration in the Great Bay estuary, which is one of our biggest saltwater water bodies in southeastern New Hampshire. So through landscape architecture, communities are adapting to these challenges by enhancing four-season recreation opportunities. For example, we recently opened Franklin Falls, which is the first whitewater park in the Northeast. Landscape architects are designing complete streets, greenway networks, and transit-oriented development to address our transportation infrastructure challenges. In the Seacoast region, we're working with scientists, engineers, and regulatory officials to develop and implement living shoreline solutions. So I just wanted to end by saying, this is why licensure and designing for public health, safety, and welfare is more critical than ever. Even as legislation in our state, and I know a lot of other states, seeks to deregulate and invalidate our work. So with that said, we sincerely appreciate the public officials that are participating in this summit today, and we really look forward to your continued support.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to all of the New England chapters who have helped us put this together, as well as our friends at Boston Design Week. So for those who are joining from Boston Design Week, it's great to have you here. This is the overall agenda for today. In just a moment, I'll hand it to Scott Bishop, who will talk very briefly about the ASLA Climate Action Plan, just to give us a basic grounding, and then turn it to Jason Hillendrung and Undersecretary Catherine Antos for her keynote presentation. And there'll be some time after that to mix up into small rooms, say hi, a little bit of networking and discussion. At noon begins a conversation with Pamela Conrad, who's here. She's the founder of Climate Positive Design and one of the primary authors of the ASLA Climate Action Plan. And we invite you all to be part of that discussion. And then we'll wrap it up at 1 o'clock with a fabulous flurry of lightning talks. And we have 14 speakers giving 12 different talks on a variety of topics. And we look forward to the next few hours together. And so Scott, with that, I'm gonna hand it to you.
All right, thanks, Gretchen. Happy to be here today, and just as many of you know from what I started to unpack the plan a couple of weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago. we wanted to just let everyone know the resources that are available from ASLA. I'm the immediate past chair of the Climate Action Committee, and I'm currently co-chair of the subcommittee of the Climate Action Network. And so what we're doing is really trying to talk about these resources that are available to you all as members of ASLA. If you are, the Climate Action Plan itself is actually is open for anyone to read about how ASLA is trying to work within the field of landscape architecture to deal with climate issues. The Climate Action Field Guide is for members only and really serves as a number of resources and tools. And some of those we're going to talk about today. Really what we're interested in is, how are we going to get to some of these aspirational goals in terms of dealing with climate change? And that begins, I think, primarily with how we start to measure things. It's like we need to know what we're doing before we can change what we're doing. And so we're going to talk about that a bit today, but we're going to also, we will be rolling out a series of talks that will help unpack the guide. But I really encourage everybody to use these resources and help them in their practice as we deal with the challenges that are forthcoming with climate change. And so today we're really excited to talk about that with all of you. Super happy to have Pamela as well, who has really been, I would say, one of the main architects of what we're going to see today. So I will pass this on to Jason, who is our current climate chair for BSLA.
Great, thanks, Scott, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody popping up on here. And thanks for joining us this morning, and thanks for joining us from all over New England and all over. I think we probably got some representation from the United States because we got folks from other chapters too, I think. A couple quick items before we jump in. Just want to talk a little bit about our event today. This is our second annual summit. Our first was last June, and the goals really of the summit was, as ASLA was developing the Climate Action Plan, and that was launched formally in November in San Francisco at the annual meeting. The goal was to start reaching out to all the state chapters and start to develop some of these regional summits that could start to, one, look at and explore what some of these climate vulnerabilities and challenges were in different regions of the country, but then also start building, bridging greater networks and relationships amongst different practitioners in those regions that may not be working with each other. And while we do that, building that body of knowledge and work, expanding our relationships, and then expanding the visibility of landscape architects. And we had a terrific summit last year. The Climate Action Plan was launched in November. Scott was great, launched it locally to our chapters here in New England last month. And it's great to be here. It's been a lot of fun working with all of the team and kind of building great networks and bridges with the other chapter presidents from Rhode Island and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Vermont and Maine. It's been a great event, and we're looking for another great event today. As we look towards today, and you'll hear it repeat a little bit in our talks from Catherine and Pamela, and then our lightning talks, we started to think about how could we tie this whole program together today. And we thought of, let's come up with this theme of just count it. Let's start focusing on metrics. And how do we start measuring the impacts that we're doing? If we start to understand what our vulnerabilities are, how do we attack them and start to make an impact on that? And so you'll hear that as a theme that we've been trying to repeat as we go through the day. So with that as a launch for today, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Antos. We are very honored and privileged to have her joining us today. And I'll read her bio so that I can really make sure that I hit it on all the great things that Catherine is doing. But you want to just note, one, she's a New Englander. She's a native Massachusettsian. I don't actually know what that is, having lived here for 30 years. I don't know if there is a word for that, but grew up in Mass. Undergrad, stayed in New England, went to Brown and got an undergrad in environmental studies, and then has a master's in planning from MIT. So very aligned in the fields, but she's just recently joined the Healy administration as Governor Maura Healy has come into office this year and has been kind of building her team. And she's the Undersecretary for Decarbonization and Resilience at the Mass Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA. And there she leads the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve net zero by 2050, equipping people, environment, and infrastructure to adapt to climate change and ensure meaningful involvement and access to benefits of the clean energy transition for environmental justice communities. Previously, Catherine served as the Deputy Executive Director for Planning and Sustainability at Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, for those of you that may know it by MAPC but don't know what the acronym stands for. She oversaw the Clean Energy, Environment, Land Use, Transportation, and Arts and Culture department's plans, technical assistance and initiatives to advance a more resilient Greater Boston region. She oversaw priority initiatives to advance watershed restoration, environmental education, workforce development, community engagement, climate mitigation and resilience, and urban agriculture at Washington, D.C.'s Department of Energy and Environment as a senior policy advisor to the director and the chief of the partnering environmental conservation branch. And she also worked with community-based organizations and the Urban Waters Federal Partnership to guide watershed restoration and waterfront priorities along the Anacostia River while there in DC, and also worked for the US EPA on the agency's Chesapeake Bay program, helping to establish and oversee an accountability framework for ecosystem restoration across the 6 states in the Chesapeake Bay region and the District of Columbia. So with all of that, I will turn things over to Catherine. Please take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And thank you to the New England chapters of the American Society of Landscape Architects for the invitation to come and speak with you today about the Commonwealth's climate goals and what we're doing to meet them, and also the role of natural and working lands in this strategy. So landscape architects are key partners in our shared vision of reaching net zero on carbon emissions and also being resilient to the impacts of a changing climate that have already started and are only going to become more intense in the years and the decades to come. So in my role as Undersecretary for Decarbonization and Resilience, I've been on the job for a month now, and I'm responsible for working with the team at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and then also the agencies that are within EEA. That includes our Department of Energy Resources, our Department of Environmental Protection, our Coastal Zone Management, and many others, Department of Conservation and Recreation. I work with them and then also across secretariats on how we can advance our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals on the decarbonization side. And then on the resilience side, how do we build resilience and adapt to a changing climate? So it certainly keeps me busy. The next slide. So what I want to talk about with you today is just some of the executive orders and legislation that really drive this work in Massachusetts, the role of natural and working lands in our decarbonization efforts, and then recent updates on some state and local climate adaptation and resilience planning and implementation. This is going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour because I feel like I could spend the whole time talking about each and every one of these topics. But really what I want to do today is just give you a sample of what we're doing in this planning and where natural and working lands fits into it. And because it's so important of the work that you do that you can help us to advance our climate goals. Next slide. So the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and the Commonwealth as a whole has been tasked with tackling climate change for some time, starting with the Global Warming Solutions Act. What I'm flagging here is a quick overview of some of the more recent executive orders and legislation that have driven work by the Baker-Polito administration, and then now that the Healy and Driscoll administration is really leaning in on us. They are laser focused on climate action, equity, and also tackling our affordability crisis. And I really see my role in braiding those pieces together. And so how can we do climate action in a way that also increases opportunity, applies an equity lens, and continues to create opportunities for our homes and jobs for residents within the Commonwealth. So Executive Order 569, can actually go back, sorry. Executive Order 569 is that Governor Baker signed, is a comprehensive approach to greenhouse gas reductions. And it also created the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP program, which is the place where we work with communities on resilience planning and implementation. Then in 2018, the Environmental Bond Bill provided resources to implement EO 569 and also codified the MVP program. There have been a few really big pieces of state legislation on climate in the past few years. The one I'm going to touch on here is the 2021 Act Creating a Next Generation Roadmap for Massachusetts Climate Policy, also known as the 2021 Climate Law. And it was really the thing that said we need to be net zero by 2050. Compared to 1990, we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And the state needs to develop a roadmap and also clean energy and climate plans that show how we're going to meet those goals for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And then Governor Healy, when she came into office, she very quickly signed Executive Order 604, which said, okay, and this isn't just EEA's responsibility. We need to take a whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis. And so she created a cabinet level climate chief, Chief Melissa Hoffer, and established an Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience. And so while I work for Secretary Tepper, the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, I work very closely also with the Climate Office in terms of looking at what are we doing within EEA, but then also how do we advance this whole of government approach, because we're all in this together to meet these decarbonization and resilience goals. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the climate law, the 2021 climate law, called on us to be net zero by 2050 and cut emissions in half by 2030, and to establish clean energy and climate plans to say how those emissions reductions will be done across the major sectors. The part I want to flag here is that natural and working lands are part of that strategy. So it's not just transportation and buildings and our electric supply are going to reduce down to zero. It's rather they're going to reduce about 85% of the way. And then we need to make sure that we maintain our carbon storage and increase our carbon sequestration capacity to then achieve our net zero goals. So it's really a balance between what the other sectors are doing to reduce and how our natural and working lands are also a key part of that strategy. Next slide. So with the commitment and then the statutory obligation to achieve the net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2050, natural and working lands are now explicitly and comprehensively incorporated into Massachusetts clean energy and climate plans for the first time. And the most important natural and working land strategy is to keep natural and working lands as natural and working lands by protecting them from permanent conversion so they can keep on storing the carbon that they are currently storing. In Massachusetts, about 3/4 of the state is classified as natural and working lands. 56% of it is forest, 10% is wetlands, and 7% is croplands and grasslands. And right now, about 27% of Massachusetts is permanently conserved or protected, either by the state or by localities or by private trusts. And so within these clean energy and climate plans, we've committed that by 2030, we aim to permanently conserve 30% of Massachusetts through conservation efforts and 40% by 2050. So the clean energy and climate plans include specific policy actions to achieve these conservation goals, including expanding support to municipalities and land trusts and regional entities for land acquisition and restoration through grants, also seeking additional state funding for state restoration and acquisition, and then leveraging federal funding sources and exploring options to channel private investment to natural and working lands conservation. Next slide. So that was just a very high level, and we can switch to the next slide. There might be a little bit of a lag. Thanks. So that was just a very high level overview of our decarbonization efforts. And now I want to pivot over to talking about adaptation and resilience. We're working to ensure that the Commonwealth and its municipalities are adapting to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing and we're going to continue to see for decades to come. At the end of last year, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs released the 2022 Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment. And what this did was assess the impacts from climate stressors, so that includes temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, and climate hazards. And sea level rise, and then also looking at climate hazards. So that's extreme heat, flooding, droughts, and look at that across 5 sectors in 7 regions in the Commonwealth. We're looking at it across 7 regions because how climate affects the coast versus the Berkshires and everywhere in between, it's different. And also in terms of who lives there and what the industries are and how residents identify within those areas, that's also different. And so we need to take a regional approach to this. And in terms of the 5 sectors, that's how does climate change affect people, infrastructure through the built environment, the natural environment, state and local governments, and then the economy in the Commonwealth. And so the climate change assessment utilized existing studies and data, local climate adaptation plans, and stakeholder impact to stakeholder input to identify priority impacts on the Commonwealth. Some highlights from the stakeholder engagement process included a group of compensated community liaisons who worked for community-based organizations throughout the Commonwealth, brought them to the table so they can talk about how climate is affecting where they live and where they work. Also brought in scientific and technical experts to work together on working groups and review the latest science and also the tools to assess it. And then it did a series of virtual public meetings with simultaneous interpretation services so that the information was available in several languages. And the findings of this assessment we're then going to use to directly inform our statewide action plan for climate adaptation. Next slide. So some of the findings from the Massachusetts climate assessment for people, the big priority impacts, and they looked at many impacts altogether. So what this slide summarizes is the top 3 impacts for each sector. So in terms of the impact on people, the biggest impacts were on mental and physical health, those impacts that are caused by extreme heat and also degraded air quality. And then also the impact of disrupted emergency response services when there is a climate emergency, how that in particular affects our priority populations who are most sensitive, who might already have underlying health conditions, so that if you disrupt that healthcare system, it's going to have an even greater impact on them. In terms of the built environment, the biggest impacts were the damage to buildings from inland flooding. We talk a lot about coastal flooding, but inland flooding is absolutely something that cannot be overlooked. And that really was the top impact that came out in this climate assessment. Also identified the impact to our electric grid, and then also impacts to public transportation infrastructure caused by extreme heat and also flooding. For the natural environment, the priority impacts were impacts on our freshwater and our marine ecosystems, and then also on forest health. And for state and local governments, they were hit by a trifecta of, with climate change, there's going to be an even greater demand for state and municipal services to help communities respond. And so that's going to lead to increasing costs on their end. But then at the same time, climate events can also lead to a decrease in tax revenues. Finally, on the economy side, the priority impacts were reducing the ability to work, to either get to a job place or the ability to work, say, during an extreme heat event. Impacts on our commercial fisheries, which are critically important here in the Commonwealth. And then also reductions in the availability of housing, either because flood risk in particular, and how if there's pressure on housing, that can only exacerbate our current affordability crisis that we're facing. Next slide. And so I encourage you to go to our website and check out the climate change assessment. You can do it in a few different ways. If you want a broad overall view of it statewide, then you can look at volume 1, which is the executive summary. The second volume, the statewide report, tells you more about what those climate change impacts are, more about how they were ranked, more about the science and the data that was used, also more about the stakeholder engagement process. So it's really more appropriate for those that are working in the field. And then the final volume really breaks down the information by region. And the thing that I really like about it is that it includes 2-page summary sheets for each region that have also been translated and are designed for a broader audience. So if you're working within a particular part of the state and you want to talk about how is climate change impacting that region, then I encourage you to look at those 2-page fact sheets. Next slide. So as we were doing the climate change assessment, we wanted to make this best available climate data and tools available to our partners, including communities, restoration professionals, landscape architects. And so we encourage you to go to resilientma.mass.gov, the Maps and Data Center, to see this information that can help to guide local and regional planning. And I'm just going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour through some of the things that you can find on that website. So next slide. There we go, thank you. So the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team put together a climate resilience design standards tool, which is an interactive and web-based tool that's received national recognition. And what it does is it informs climate smart capital planning and project review by providing recommendations for consistent use of the state's climate data in planning and designing of physical assets. It provides an easy to use planning and design support tool for agencies and also municipalities, and it makes preliminary climate resilience analysis more broadly accessible across agencies. Next slide. So one component of this is the preliminary climate exposure score, which provides a preliminary assessment of whether the overall project site and subsequent assets are exposed to the impacts of natural hazard events or future impacts of climate change. And this does not substitute for a formal vulnerability assessment, but this score ranks areas from not exposed to low, moderate, or high, and it's valid for the project as a whole. It's based on a GIS analysis that looks at location and also exposure layers for sea level rise, precipitation, rivering, flooding, and heat, and plus responses to a limited number of user questions about flood history, net impervious surface, and tree removal. Next slide. And then the next thing is risk ratings. And so this tool provides an initial screening to identify projects and assets with a high risk designation, which may warrant additional review or design considerations. So the tool can accommodate multiple asset entries, such as buildings and facilities, infrastructure, and natural resources. And these assets receive a preliminary climate risk rating that's derived from how a user answered the questions in the input page, along with the overall project site's climate exposure score. And so again, these risk ratings go from low to high. Next slide. And then we come to our resilience design standards. So for each asset, the tool will give recommended design standards for 2 climate parameters, extreme precipitation and extreme heat, and then a third for sea level rise and storm surge, if applicable. And the recommendations include target and intermediate planning horizons, and the tool also gives a list of applicable design criteria to consider for early project planning and design. And next slide. So again, I encourage you to go to our website, check it out, play around with it, reach out to our team if you have further questions. But the main point here is we did a lot of work to pull together this mass climate change assessment, and we didn't want to just hold it for the assessment. We wanted to put it out so that our partners can be using it too. And one of the ways that we're using the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment is we're pulling that into our state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, which was first developed in 2018, and we are in the process of updating it now. What makes Massachusetts really unique and a leader is that states have been doing for a long time, state hazard mitigation plans. It's something that they have to do to be eligible for federal dollars from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. But what Massachusetts did is they said, and this needs to pull in climate adaptation as well. And so the final product is a plan that will guide state agency actions to make our state assets more resilient to climate change impacts. Next slide. And so the time frame is we're currently finalizing that plan. We're going to be submitting it to FEMA for their approval this summer and then releasing it in September. And so I can't tell you yet what those state actions are. I will say there are hundreds of them. There's a lot going on, not just within EEA, across secretariats, that whole of government approach. But one of the state actions that I can talk about that you would see in the SHMCAT that I'm going to talk about a bit now is our municipal vulnerability preparedness program, because something that came up in the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, and I always say if it's not an acronym, it's not government, so the SHMCAP, is it talked about how the Commonwealth really needs to deepen its engagement with communities on resilience planning and facilitate resilience action at the local level. And so one way that we're going to be looking to build on previous work now in the Healy-Driscoll administration is through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. This is a program that has existed since 2017, and to date, 349 out of our 351 cities and towns participate in the program. That's a 99% participation rate. And so if these communities, they get technical assistance to do MVP plans, and then once they do, they become eligible for MVP action grants to give them resources to implement an aspect of those plans, a project within those plans, which is going to build their community resilience. This program has grown exponentially, and so since its beginnings, we have awarded over 300 MVP action grants and put over $100 million towards this effort. Next slide. And so the MVP program operates off of 10 core principles. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but what I want to flag is that these 10 core principles are essentially the scoring criteria for the MVP action grant application process. That's a bit of a mouthful. But some of the most important ones include centering environmental justice, conducting robust community engagement, employing nature-based solutions, utilizing up-to-date climate data, and encouraging regional partnerships and solutions. Next slide. And so I wanted to provide some examples of strong nature-based MVP action grants to share with you today that most align with your areas of expertise as landscape architects. First, the Malden River Works was first funded in FY21 to support concept designs as well as ongoing community engagement for the development of a resilient waterfront park at Malden's Department of Public Works, or DPW yard, which is the only public access point to the Malden River in Malden. The project is led by a community steering committee, and it includes several green infrastructure elements to alleviate flooding, including bioretention areas with native plantings and additional trees. By the end of this fiscal year, they will have completed up to 90% designs and are working on permitting. The next one I want to flag is in Falmouth, the Coonamessett River Restoration, and it was funded back in 2019. And so in this case, the MVP funding came along later in the process to bring this project across the finish line. The project partners have been working on this effort to restore Cranberry Bog for more than a decade in order to create more flood storage, as well as an educational public trail for residents and visitors to enjoy. And the MVP Action Grant resources help to get it done. Finally, in the city of Northampton, a formal public golf course has been restored to its more natural historic hydrology. And so the project team removed the drainage and irrigation infrastructure. It restored the historic wetlands that had previously been on site, and that also included native plantings and trees. Next slide. So really our MVP action grants, they provide our resources for a range of different projects. whether that's capacity building, design and permitting, or construction and implementation, or also even land acquisition. Next slide. So the program has had some great success since its beginnings, but we always want to be doing better. And so the MVP team engaged a consulting team to create a new process that would serve as the next iteration of the MVP planning grant, which we are calling MVP 2.0. So during this process, the MVP team collected extensive feedback on the original planning process through an iterative series of surveys and virtual meetings with stakeholders who had worked with the MVP program in the past, including municipal staff, consultants, and community-based organization representatives. And this slide just shows some of the high-level takeaways from the feedback that we collected and hope to address through the MVP 2.0 program. So some of the feedback was communities were expressing planning fatigue. They really wanted to focus more on implementation and action. They really wanted to better understand how to incorporate social vulnerability. They wanted to make sure that they were providing agency to environmental justice communities through this municipal resilience planning and action. Next slide. And so after our review of the MVP program, this spring, Governor Healy launched MVP 2.0 as a pilot, and we're really excited about this new program. And I'm saying we're launching it as a pilot because we're going to test how the 2.0 framework is doing and then use that to see, did we hit it or do we need to make some additional adjustments? So aspects of the 2.0 planning process that differ from before is there's a greater emphasis on environmental justice and engagement, and that includes training for municipal staff. It includes bringing community partners into the planning process and compensating them for their participation. It also involves 2-year grants where the first year is focused on planning to update a community's resilience priorities. And then the second year is resources for seed funds that are actually doing an on-the-ground project that can help to catalyze implementation. And by doing the 2.0 planning process, communities stay eligible for future action grants. It's also a way to inform the state directly how the planning process is going and if we need to make additional changes. So we are currently seeking applications from municipalities, eligible tribes, and regional planning agencies who are applying on behalf of a municipality or municipalities. Those applications are due on May 19th, and it's a quick application process. If you've worked with partners on action grant applications, it's simpler than that. The biggest thing is you just need to make sure that you have a letter of support from the chief official of the applicant, be it a town manager or a select board chair supporting the application. Next slide. And so another great aspect of the MVP program that I just want to highlight too is similar to the climate change assessment. We don't just look at the state as a whole, we break it into regions. And so within the MVP program since 2019, there have been regional coordinators. There are currently 6 who are assigned to work specifically in different parts of the Commonwealth to really understand the unique challenges and opportunities around resilience planning and action. They have one-on-one conversations with each of these municipalities. And so if you don't already know these folks, I definitely encourage you to get to know them, get to know some of the action grant projects that have happened in different communities throughout the Commonwealth. And that, I wanna make sure that we have some time for questions. And so those were the highlights of what's happening on the decarbonization and resilience front in the Commonwealth. And with that, if there's time, I'm happy to take a couple questions.
Fantastic, Catherine. Thank you so much. There's a few questions that are starting to come up into the chat. And then also, you know, being in this big Zoom meeting, I encourage you to keep adding questions to the chat or just raise your hand using your Zoom controls and we'll call on you. So I'm just going to start with the first one that I see here. And that says, okay, they're coming in. This is great. If you didn't participate in MVP 2.0, are you still eligible for future action grants through MVP using your original planning process?
So certainly for this year, the action grant application period that's wrapping up, any of our MVP communities were eligible to apply. And I think when we do the next round of action grants, we'll make the decision of, is that the point at which it can only be those that have been through the 2.0 process, or if you've recently done a 1.0 plan, would you still be eligible? So through the pilot process, we're really trying to focus on the communities first that have the oldest plans, getting them to update their plans, because that's going to be more meaningful than like updating a plan that was just done last year. So eventually you will have to have that 2.0 to be eligible, but in terms of when we actually make that switch, I think that's actually something that we're going to consider during the pilot process.
Tom is noting that it's so cool to see the breadth of projects that MVP is funding within the state. And so that comment is coming from Vermont. And I'll just say that, yes, that's exactly part of our point here today, is to try to learn across these political boundaries, because, you know, climate really doesn't care at all about the political boundaries. And we need to be thinking and working together. I'm going to read Meg's question and then I'll call on you, Jess. Meg asks, what type of firm performs a formal vulnerability assessment? Who does environmental justice training for staff?
So previously in the 1.0 process, what the Commonwealth did was it came up of a list of approved vendors that then communities could work with on their 1.0 plan. And there was some concern about, it really varied across the range, the degree to which some of those vendors were really able to do some of, say, more the deeper engagement needs that a community might have, versus just kind of doing a little more of an off-the-shelf plan. And so this time around, instead of us coming in and saying, and here's your pre-approved vendors, we're saying, these are the criteria that exist in terms of, can this entity help with a 2.0 plan? So it talks more about their ability to do community engagement and some of the technical aspects of the MVP 2.0 plan as well. And so I would encourage you, if you have questions or ideas about who a potential partner would be, and you just want to make sure that they would be qualified to lead this work, reach out to Karen Runstein, our MVP program director, or Marissa Robertson, the program deputy director, to answer particular questions there. But one piece of feedback we heard is, you know, state, don't just come up with your qualified list of vendors. There might actually be a better partner to help with this process. So more make it clear, what do these vendors need to be prepared to do in working with communities.
Thank you. And I'll just say out loud that we'll share these slides afterwards, so there's no need to frantically write down these email addresses here. Jess.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I was interested in that golf course restoration example from Northampton. Mm-hmm. Is there like a larger kind of statewide mission or goal or focus on those types of projects, or is that just like specific to their situation of taking golf courses and restoring the natural hydrology and ecology?
Yeah, so I would have to talk to the team to see were there other examples similar to that. But I will say, when we're thinking about our resilient lands initiatives and our strategies there, it's how can we think about how these lands are managed so that they can increase their carbon storage and sequestration capacity, and also meet other ecosystem goals in terms of habitat, water quality, flood resilience, both inland and coastal, depending on where they're located. So it's not just acquiring more acres and getting to that 30%, 40%, but also how are we managing those lands in a way to support their ecosystem values.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll also just add that starting in the pandemic and continuing, we've been doing a series of outdoor on-site tours that we call Inside Out, turning our conference inside out. And seeing that site, visiting that site was one of our first tours. A couple years ago now. And those sites are continuing. So in a separate thing, I'll invite you all to ask, where do you want to go this year?
That would be wonderful. And anytime you want to co-host a tour with the MVP program, get some ideas for some of those action grant sites to visit, or have a member of the MVP team be part of that and those community partners, please let us know. We'd be happy to do that. We love doing that. Absolutely. Andrew was part of that tour with us then, and would love to do more. So I'll follow up with you on that. There's a question here. How did the Resilient Lands Initiative and Healthy Soils Action Plan interact with the decarbonization and mitigation goals? Yeah, so much of meeting our decarbonization goals has to do with how do we get that carbon into the soil, and then how do we keep it there? And so we're thinking about our forests, we're thinking about our wetlands, and we're also thinking about our farmlands and like agricultural practices that you can take so that you're bringing that carbon into the soil and you're not doing actions such as tilling or things like that that are then going to release that carbon back out again. So it's looking across the ways that we manage our different kinds of natural and working lands to meet those goals. And I will say oftentimes too, there's co-benefits, like what you're doing to increase soil health on farms is also going to be good for crops. It's also going to be good for water quality and other benefits as well.
Well, Catherine, I'll wrap things up here for this first session. And two things. I'll ask you for a closing comment, and I'll guide you on that because it's a loaded closing comment. But first, just want to say thank you. But want to ask you to make a closing comment. And what I would love to hear you talk about is partnerships, because the thing that really struck me was a couple things this morning. Was one, I think it was your second slide where it showed all the initiatives from EEA. And it was sort of striking to see some of these priorities from the Baker administration, but then carrying forward in the Healy administration, which I think is kind of unique in this day and age of politics. And I think that probably is reflective with your past working with Chesapeake Bay Watershed and working with multiple states. And so as we're here with this ASLA Summit for the New England chapters, what kind of thoughts, guidance, challenges would you have for all of our participants this morning related to partnerships, and as we're looking at trying to address climate impacts in each of our states, but do it in a collaborative way? And with that, thank you for everything this morning.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we are stronger together. We can't do it alone. And we each know a bit of how we're gonna address this climate crisis, but together we know a lot. And so we need the expertise of landscape architects. We need the expertise of environmental justice communities. We need the expertise of our scientists to figure out what are the best ways to move forward. And so absolutely, we want to be hearing from you as landscape architects. What are innovative ways to make natural areas increase their carbon sequestration value, or other benefits too that aren't directly related to the climate crisis, but are also important, such as habitat, such as outdoor recreation opportunities. And so certainly we want to hear from you, your best practices and what are the opportunities out there, but also what are some of the specific challenges that we need to address as well, such as, is it a resource issue, or regulatory or zoning concerns, or scientific technical questions that we can really lean in and help to answer and resolve in partnership together as we work together to rise to this moment, because it's a huge challenge, but it's even greater opportunity. And so we really have a moment now with federal resources, with state resources, with really high level leadership, deeply committed to this to do some great things together.
All right, thank you very much. Everybody's heard it. You've gotten a challenge, so Catherine wants to hear from you. And if you're not from Massachusetts, reach out to your reps in each of your respective states. But thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your meeting.
Thank you. Gretchen, do you want to take us through our next item here? You just pulled it up, I see.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to break out into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And the point really is to just say hi and meet some folks here so that we're not just all on a screen. We have a few prompts, and if you want to use them, great. And if you just want to say hi, that's totally fine too. The prompts are to share a few issues you're seeing, maybe something you're seeing now that you didn't see a few years ago. What actions are you taking? How are you starting to communicate that value? And if you want to get into how you're measuring impact or how you'd like to measure impact, any of that we offer as prompts. With this, I'm randomly assigning you into small rooms.
And Gretchen, one question on that too. Did you want folks related to these prompts? Did you want anyone to write that on the Jamboard if they want?
Yes.
Not,
oh,
okay.
Jason, you're so good. Yes, exactly. And I'm about to put that link in the chat. That we'll put that Jamboard link there too as a place to take some notes and share some things together. And then we'll mix it up again, in about an hour after we talk to Pamela. But so for about 10 minutes now, just say hi to some folks. You're being randomly assigned. So for anyone who can hear me, who's just joining now, folks are in breakout rooms and we're about to bring them back. And for those coming back, welcome back.
I was in the midst of talking to my crew about having beers with Jen Martell because Karen Fitzgerald from New Hampshire was there. And we were very abruptly whisked back into this room.
Here you go. It's not 5 o'clock yet, Jason, but soon.
Yeah, I'm just drinking water here. So
that's what you guys are talking about in your breakout, was drinking beers.
only briefly.
We have much different focus.
It's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
And I saw you pop on earlier, Paul. Like, great to see you. I saw you pop on and say hello, and I was like, and Paul Pawlowski's here, like probably the oldest landscape architect, not in age, but I know. But that I know. Going back, it's got to be over 30 years, I think. So great to see you.
Perhaps even longer, Jason.
Yeah, great to see you. Hope you're well.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Gretchen, are you ready for us to get rolling, or are people rolling back in right now?
The people are coming back in. I'm just going to advance the slide. We're going to switch over to conversation format, and I'm actually going to stop sharing the slides.
Okay.
And just switch to format, Jason, and hand it over to you.
Okay.
Hopefully in that breakout, you had a chance to say hi to somebody new. That's part of the point of this, is to connect with each other. And we'll do this again in about, 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so. But first, Jason, let me hand it to you and to Stephen and to Pamela.
All right. And maybe I'll explain what we're going to do, but maybe, Gretchen, I don't know if you can pin Pamela and Stephen and myself. I don't know if you can pin multiple people. We're kind of on the fly here, but we're going to start a conversation with Pamela Conrad, and you can see it right there. But Pamela is right now in Boston via San Francisco, but for I think the past year has been Loeb Fellow at Harvard for 2023. I think wrapping up right about now her year fellowship. She's a founder of Climate Positive Design. She worked with Scott and was the chair of the ASLA Climate Action Plan. And she launched the Pathfinder tool in terms of measuring carbon. And so what we wanted to do here was we're going to have a conversation with her. Joining me is Stephen Mansfield, who's actually been working with all of our team for the past couple months as we put the program together today. But Stephen is the chair of the main chapter. So Stephen, thanks for joining me and welcoming Pamela. And with that, Pamela, we're going to turn it over to you and talk to us. We want to give you a couple minutes here to get us started in this discussion, but tell us a little bit about your history, kind of professionally, your trajectory that led you to kind of where you are right now, developing the Pathfinder tool and everything you've been up to. But tell us a little bit about yourself and get us started here. And after a little bit, we're going to open it up to Q&A, to the whole, to all the participants this morning. But Pamela, let's hear it.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you, Jason, for teeing it up, and for Gretchen, everyone, all your hard work and just the effort around this. I think it's amazing. And I'm just honestly so proud of our profession for stepping up to this challenge. And so I just wanted to say thank you all for your efforts. And I actually suggested this format because I was hoping for it to just be a little bit more of a conversation and just a little bit more discussion. I think sometimes when we are just talking and sharing with each other, we can actually learn the most. So that's my hope. This is a little bit of a test, but we'll see how this goes. So just to touch base on what you were just saying, Jason, a little bit about myself and my trajectory. So I, as you mentioned, everyone, I'm in Cambridge right now, but I originally grew up, and I'm sorry, I have to go way back because my relationship to landscape goes back to my childhood. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I fell in love with nature at a really early age. I was always dirty, never wearing my dresses that my mom tried to put on me. And I started working in a nursery at a really young age. Then I transferred into working on a landscaping crew, and I'm talking like before I could drive here, like 12 years old. I was managing a landscape crew in high school, all men. And then, one day I was working in one of my neighbor's yards, and she was very kind, and she put a landscape architecture magazine in front of me and said, "This is a career. This is a profession. Like, you can do this. You are already doing this." And I think just that great having people in your life like that champion you to do this kind of work is what led me to become a landscape architect. I got a plant science degree from the University of Missouri. I'm a first generation college graduate. And then I got my MLA at Cal Poly Pomona, which was focused on sustainability and regenerative design. And so I've kind of been building my whole life and career around this subject. Worked in all kinds of range of firms and practice, from City Parks and Rec to Army Corps of Engineers, different sizes of firms, from Cheryl Barton's office to SWA and CMG. So for the last 20 years. And the last 10 years, I've been focusing on climate issues. Specifically, the prior 5 years to coming here, I was leading the urban design for San Francisco Waterfront Resilience Program. And probably, Jason, really similar to the efforts that you are working on here in the Boston, Climate Ready Boston work. And I think that's what started for me, really questioning clearly we have a role into adapting to what's happening with climate change, and the sea level is already rising. We're working on adaptation plans. The work I was doing was 7.5 miles of downtown San Francisco. So very, very in your face, equity issues, all the things. And, that just kind of scale and started asking me questions. I can clearly see how we're contributing to adapting to climate change, but I don't really understand my impacts of my projects, or are we contributing to some of these issues? And it was that question that came to mind for me, that I wanted to know the carbon footprint of my projects. I thought I'd go online that afternoon, do some quick calcs, and I would understand it. And the reality is that just didn't exist 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And so it was through working on a fellowship from the Landscape Architecture Foundation that I was able to take a really cool, crude spreadsheet and launched the Pathfinder app 3 years ago. And I went through like that measurement. What I found is the projects that I thought were really sustainably designed had a pretty significant carbon footprint. And once I started to see the numbers in front of me, I could better understand, well, where were the biggest impacts? What are the changes that I could have made? And in some of my projects, what I realized is that I could have made pretty straightforward, easy changes, swap out some materials, use cement substitutions, add some more trees. And those projects across the board were able to cut their emissions in half and double sequestration. And some of those projects were going to take 200 years to offset their carbon footprints, and instead could have been done in 20 by just making those changes and measuring those impacts. And so I was pretty shocked by that, kind of embarrassed. And I thought, great, I need to do this on my projects. I need to change my business as usual, so does my firm, but how can we do this as an entire profession? And so in launching the tool and the Climate Positive Design Challenge, that was my intention, is to help all of us improve our impacts collectively. And yeah, so that's kind of in the nutshell what I've been up to and what brought me to this point.
Awesome. That's great. You know, there's obviously many of us on this call are familiar with the Pathfinder tool, but there's many of us that are also not. Could you kind of describe, and that's also the link to the Pathfinder tool is in the chat right now for anybody that's interested in clicking on that and checking it out. But can you kind of describe how it works and how people can utilize it within their own projects at various scales?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And so the Pathfinder, it's a free web-based app, and how it was developed initially was from feedback, actually, from the very honest group of fellows that I was working on the LA fellowship with. And the kind of three main points were that it needed to be easy, that we could kind of seamlessly integrate into our existing workflow, and that also would give us feedback. So knowing that what the changes that you were making, what kind of impact did that have? So it's pretty simple. You just get your quantities from whether it's your material area or your quantities of trees or plants or your operations plans, plug them into the app, and it gives you a red number for emissions, green number for sequestration, and then it gives you a years to positive score, so how many years it's going to take for your project to offset itself. And then that was really what that score is how it was informing the Climate Positive Design Challenge targets. And so that was really looking at a pretty broad range of projects to see what's our kind of baseline business as usual, and what could we do pretty easily, not drastic changes, but it was kind of across the board. You're reducing your emissions in half, doubling your sequestration, and that got you to kind of those years to positive targets. So that's set currently for 5 years to positive for kind of greener projects like parks or campus, hospitality, gardens, and 20 years for more urban projects like streetscapes and plazas. And so that's just based on that. Typically, you have to have more paving for those to support the programming of those projects. And so the tool then also provides suggestions on how to improve your carbon footprint of your projects, and give you some outputs like PDF scorecards that you can input into presentations to clients. And then the outputs, so all of our projects data is incorporated into a database. And so we then can measure how we're doing as a profession globally. Actually, we can start to see, okay, how are our projects doing when we started, how are projects doing now? And that's what's really exciting to see. And we're collecting that, and it helps us to inform advocacy efforts. And the challenge is really similar to like the AIA 2030 commitment, if any of you all are familiar with that. There are other kind of challenges out there for us to use as reference. And I want to drop in, just in case that's not totally clear to everybody. Actually recently gave a lecture, hi Maria, at the BAC, and they recorded the demo and the talk. So I can put that in the chat for anybody that wants to watch a demo of the tool. It's available online on the website, and I'll just drop it in here.
I had to get off mute because I clicked on the link that Gretchen and the video started, and I couldn't pause it. And I had YouTube in one window, I had Zoom in the other, but
Okay.
multitasking. But Paola, thank you. Kind of the thought about sort of when you utilize the tool in the design process, and just sort of thinking, I think about over the last 25 plus years working, and I'd say since probably the early 2000s, when I think like LEED started to take hold, early 2000s, and trying to present things around sustainability. And there's always this push and pull where you're trying to present things from, I'd say, a more general qualitative sustainability perspective, and you get pushback from a client. How do you feel like with your design process and kind of what you're learning from the tool is helping you with clients as you move forward? And I would guess it's front and center what you're doing. And so clients are probably hiring you because of the tool, and they want that to inform things. But how does it affect your design process and work with them?
Yeah, and I think you are right about that, Jason. Honestly, that would probably be my biggest advice, is just to start as early as possible. And I would even encourage people to start that conversation in an interview, or include it in your RFP that this is a priority, include it in your quals, that this is something that you do, it's part of your practice. It's like measuring and treating stormwater, right? That you are very forward about that more often than not. And it's increasingly becoming more well received that clients, even if they're not that aware about it, that they're excited about it and they want to be doing it. And so, like you said, you may actually get a job because you are well versed in this, and you're actually going to be able to plug into the multidisciplinary conversation around carbon. So I think just starting as early as possible, because it's also easier to make those big changes early on. You'll know as you go through the design process, when you get into CDs, you're not going to be able to remove a whole area of plaza at that point in time. But if you can start off at the beginning, and I think also with a couple of key principles in mind, we were talking a lot about, and it was great to hear Catherine talk about the importance of preservation. I think we know how important it is to preserve ecosystems. I think from a biodiversity standpoint, which is so critical, it's also critical for preserving those carbon sinks. And then I think second, to maximize your planting area versus paving area. It's a really easy relationship or formula to start off with. I mean, if you can strive for, say 70% planting on your site and the remainder paved, you're already kind of going down that path that you're going to have a lower carbon footprint just by looking at that ratio is one thing to think about. And then I would think to focus on your materials. So materials make up about 75% of our emissions that we're seeing in projects that we've been tracking over the past 3 years. And so that's primarily, and this is the same for the building industry as well, the overall built environment, that especially from concrete and steel, those are the largest emitters, material emitters. And so we can focus on using cement substitutions in our concrete, and then also using the highest percentage of recycled metal possible. And if you're looking for cement substitution specifications, you can check out the RMI Concrete Solutions Guide. They've got great guidance in there. We did include some in the ASLA Climate Action Plan of just some different cement substitutions. But you're looking for kind of more detailed specification language, you can look at that guide. And I think just generally, it's just also important to update your quantities in every stage of the project. That's what I would recommend. Don't try to do it for like every day, because you're obviously going to wear yourself out doing that. But I think if you're doing it, at least one kind of milestone per each phase, and then continue to do that at the end of your project, it's just going to become more like your natural flow of your projects.
Awesome. And it sounds like there's a lot of great things that, we can just, even that we're amassing from all this information that's, I'm assuming, is being collected and gathered into a larger database that people can utilize to start from as a good starting point for any project across the board. And that's that, you kind of touched on the AIA 2030 plan, and then I saw some comments about the 2050 structural engineers plan. Do you see this tool being relevant for municipalities, states, as well as other professions that we work with, that they could utilize it themselves?
Yeah, definitely. I can touch on kind of both how this relates to the other industry-wide challenges and also other municipalities. So in regards to being adopted by municipalities, Toronto has been the leader so far. They've incorporated using the Pathfinder and taking the challenge in their new green building standards and their RFP requirements. There are also other states that are working and cities working to incorporate, such as Dallas and San Francisco. And I think it's also been referenced and was foundational in developing the LEED and site carbon pilot credits. And so it's kind of gaining traction. But I think honestly, this is just the beginning, because likely because what's happening right now at the building level is happening faster in terms of building codes changing, is happening faster than it is for infrastructure and sites. So we're already seeing embodied carbon codes for buildings already be in place, New York, LA.
Oh, did we lose her?
Oh, something.
We might have had a little bit of a freeze. I will, well, while we're waiting for Pamela to get her connection back, I will say we, when we launched the summit, the goal was to do this virtually. And we had this discussion last year. Should we do this virtually or should we get together? And we said, well, it's New England, we can get more participants. And so we chose to do that again. It's great because we do have a wide array. So Pamela, back to you. We lost you for a second. I was just filling space there for a second, but you're right in the middle of a very intelligent answer. So.
I don't know exactly where I left off or where you last heard me, but the main thing is embodied carbon codes are already coming and in place for buildings. And so they are going to be coming for infrastructure and landscapes as well. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to get ahead of this and not be caught off guard when your next project is saying this is the maximum embodied carbon that you can have per square foot on your project, because I'm working with cities. They want to know what the standards should be. And because it's already happening in architecture, it's just a matter of time that it's going to come our way too. And then,
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump into the what is happening with the other kind of industry-wide efforts. And so, and because I know we're already running out of time here, but so there's currently a multidisciplinary coalition effort happening that's being convened by Architecture 2030, the Carbon Leadership Forum, Building Transparency, ILFI, and basically what they're doing as part of an effort with the Wholesome Foundation is supporting is bringing all the leaders of all the industry challenges together so that we can work to align them all, because the reality is they've all happened pretty quickly, but actually in an organic way. And so all the challenges don't exactly line up right now in terms of what are their goals, what are you measuring, what data are you capturing, and so what we need to do, and we are doing through this effort, is coming together, just, pretty for the first time, and now saying, okay, let's get on the same page here so we can make it easier for everybody, for practitioners that, are multidisciplinary teams that are saying like, well, we're trying to do this, but it aligns with this, this commitment and it doesn't align with this. And so anyway, that's just a big effort that's happening right now to get our whole, because we're stronger and more effective if we're all working together. But it's hard for people when we're not aligned.
So with that, and I will just say, when you froze, the thought that went through my mind was, oh God, I didn't freeze. So I'm glad it was you and not me, but I think we handled that pretty seamlessly. But along your comment around the alignment, I was going to ask, where do you see as kind of a next step for the tool? Is it integration with some of those other tools? Is there an area that you're seeing now that you're utilizing it, saying, oh, we've got to add this to the tool? And that might be that might be something proprietary that you don't want to share, but what's sort of next for it?
No, yeah, it's and I'm very transparent about this, and everybody that's been, going to the website and saying, okay, we need this additional feature added. Like there's a huge running wish list of, materials to add or features to add and ways to make it better. And I've been currently working with Chris Hardy at Sasaki. He's been developing a really strong data set. And so he's launching that out of his LAF fellowship this June. And I've been reviewing it. So our goal is to update both of our tools with the new data. And then we're hoping to get an API. So it would link Carbon Conscience. So if you're doing a planning project, doing it in Carbon. And then
you're back.
Okay. And then link from Carbon Conscience. And so your quantities would directly come from Carbon Conscience into the Pathfinder app. So you wouldn't have to manually enter them in twice. And also just working on a possibility of being able to put your quantities in a spreadsheet that you could say upload into the tool and then they're automatically in there. So ClimateWorks Foundation is helping support this effort so we can expand the basically the data and materials that are in there. I'm working to sync other tools and align them. So also hoping to coordinate with getting into like maybe TallyCat, or there's a few different options out there just to make it more seamless in everybody's workflow. And then hoping actually to expand it into some other areas to include infrastructure and also other co-benefits. So showing how, if you're making a good carbon conscious decision, it also has biodiversity potential benefits, water conservation benefits, equitable benefits if you're helping underserved communities. And so I'm working on trying to get funding to advance the tool to expand in that way, because everybody's asking for it, frankly, and the municipalities want it too. So that's a goal. There's a lot happening, and I think the main thing about just the tool, and you were mentioning like proprietary, and my intention is always to make this free and accessible for everybody and be really transparent about it. And so I think the main thing for us to be conscious about is our ability to collect the data and report is one of our greatest forms of advocacy. And because we have a tool that links to a dashboard database right now, we don't have to manually report our projects like they have to do at the AAA 2030 commitment. What happens there is you use any number of random tool, and then you have to go through this really onerous process of getting all your own metrics and do all this reporting to the AIA. So we can do that automatically now. So I think that one thing for us to be aware of, if a bunch of tools start popping up and they aren't reporting or they are not connected to something like this, we will kind of lose some of our advocacy ability to see like, how are our projects progressing? How much emissions have we cut back as a profession? And so it's just one kind of thing that I'm acutely aware of and trying to stay on top of, because we wanted the ASLA to be able to go to the UN and say, like, look at our profession, we've cut our emissions by 20% in the past couple of years. So it's a big part of this, is that reporting and tracking.
Awesome. Well, there's obviously a ton of stuff that we could continue going through and unload to better understand this and figure out how we can use it. But we also see a lot of questions kind of popping up over here in the chat channel. I want to make sure we can touch on some of those. So Gretchen, I think it's kind of back to you for that portion.
Sure. Well, don't go away, guys, but let me read through some of these. There was a question early on about what the most common change is that's suggested. And I think you touched on that a little bit, but.
Yeah, I actually don't know what the most common. I would assume that it's just if you're using standard concrete, they use cement substitutions. It's becoming more standardized. They're becoming more available, and so I think it's one of the performance is the same. Essentially, as long as you're not putting too much cement substitutions in. I know in San Francisco, it's already in their standard municipal requirements to use. I think it's like 25%. So it's something that everybody can be working with their, agencies to incorporate.
You mentioned also, I guess, how would you touched on just how dramatic it is when you switch materials from sort of hardscape to softscape and planting, and like how dramatic is that in things too, where you're just like, whoa, that's pretty high. Whoa, that just brought it down really low. Or how does that affect things?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty significant. You just think about, the 1 square foot of paving, which is a net emitter, versus if that's planting and it's a net sink, it does have some associated emissions with it. I can't say like off the top of my head what that number is, but you'll see as you're using the tool. If here's 100 square feet of paving and that emissions, and here's 100 square feet of planting, and then has that net positive, and you can see that right in the tool.
One of the great things that's happening in the chat is people are pasting in links to other resources too. And I'll say, we'll compile that. We actually have an ongoing resource list. It's just a Google Doc, and we'll share that. I'll share that in the chat in a moment, but then we'll also send that out afterwards. And we invite you to add to that to help us, to help us all learn from each other. One of the questions here, do you have a stamp or some sort of certification or logo that can be added to drawings when they reach a low carbon footprint? And let me add a follow-up. Or is there a way for us to communicate that to clients and others?
Yeah, it's a really good suggestion. So far, because this was such a new concept for our profession a few years back, the idea, rather than making some sort of commitment was that anybody that logged a project is recognized as a contributor on the website. So if you log a project, you'll see the name of your firm, whatever you entered in is on the website, like, good job just for trying it, you know? And so that's where we've been. I think where we need to go is that to actually formalize a commitment for, maybe it's for firms to sign up to say, okay, we've committed to doing this on our project, or we've committed to meeting these targets, or we are meeting these targets, and we establish a formal kind of commitment program where we could then say, we could verify that, and then also say, you know, here's the certification, here's the logo, and you know, we can really get more rigorous with it. And so I'm hoping that can be developed in the next coming years, but not yet.
I think that kind of runs out of the questions in the chat a little bit there, but you know, you're kind of finishing up your Loeb fellowship at the GSD right now. Where do you see your work and continuing on all these things going from this point forward and into the future?
Yeah, so I mean, as you can imagine, because I kind of fell into this as I was basically, you know, taking on this advocacy work at the same time as being a principal at a firm, you know, leading significant resilience projects, that quickly led to being 2 full-time jobs. And so for me, being a part of the Loeb Fellowship was a really huge opportunity kind of to take a step back and evaluate that. And so where I've landed is actually, I'm going to stick around in Boston. And so I will be around, and I'm going to be teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Design this coming year. I'll be teaching one of the Climate by Design classes and a climate positive design workshop. And it's been great to have the support of Gary Hildebrand and Amy Whitesides. There's a bunch of people, and Jill. We've been connected through the GSD. And so I think just advocating for increased climate education, and then also formalizing Climate Positive Design's nonprofit to continue expanding the app, and a new toolkit's going to be coming out this summer, and just adding more workflow resources for people, and then staying connected to Design by Consulting. So I'm actually currently working on a project with Stimson that we've just started working on Penn State's campus this summer. And so I'm really open to collaboration and on climate focused projects with folks, so that I can continue to stay connected through design while participating in these advocacy and education efforts as well.
Pamela, I'm wearing my Penn State hat today, just for.
There he is. Nice, Matt. I like it. It's a good Friday for you.
Before I saw the image pop up, I recognized the voice, but I saw you pop up earlier, Matt. So good to see you here.
Yeah, you too.
Another former colleague. So great to see you here. Great to see you.
Awesome.
Gretchen, are there any more questions in the chat?
I would say let's shift it to breakout rooms for a little bit. Okay. But I'm delighted, Pamela, to hear that you're going to be with us for a while. So you're part of our chapter now.
I know. I'm excited too. It's a great group to be a part of.
And welcome and glad to hear you're staying, but I want to thank you also for joining us in the conversation here. And when you started, you're kind of talking a little bit about your work, it kind of hit me. I was like, you know what? I hadn't really thought of it when we were exchanging emails over the last couple of days, but I remember seeing you present with Martha Schwartz on the panel at ASLA, I think in Philly, and I'm going to guess it was like 2018 or 2019. Mm-hmm. And just sort of thinking like the timeline when you talked about your LAF fellowship and starting the tool, I'm like, kind of like that was, I think, the studio that kind of started it all. So it's great to see how things have really evolved over the last 4 or 5 years or so. But thanks for joining us, and great to see the work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing it in the years ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And so everybody, as we look at the time here together, I want to spend a little bit more time, or invite you to spend a little bit more time with each other in small groups, in breakout rooms, just to say hi, or if you like to talk about climate issues, actions, and how you're starting to communicate and measure impact. Those are the prompts, but again, it's okay to just say hello and meet somebody new. I invite you to do that for about 10 minutes or so, and then also take a break for about 10 minutes or so, or however you want to do that. And we'll start back here together at 1 o'clock for the lightning talks. Any questions about that? All right, I'll put the same prompts back into the chat so that you have them and that link to the Jamboard. Again, say hi to somebody new, chat with each other, and then go take a brief break, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thank you, Gretchen. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. My name is Ashan Suking, and I'm accompanied here with Ali Casella. We're both part of the landscape architecture and planning team here at Langen. We are a design firm that has a key focus on collaboration between different disciplines across the board. And today we're going to talk about Return to the Riverbend, our master planning project in Middletown, Connecticut. Next slide, please. To give some bearings, Middletown is a city along the Connecticut River, 20 miles south of Hartford. The river directly interacts with the majority of our site. You can see bordered in white. There's also a close proximity to downtown. What's also called out here is that many of the decommissioned industrial facilities, they contributed to a lot of the contaminations within our site. And with that, we divided the waterfront into 4 different key districts that deemed appropriate for the use and programs. And we were also able to identify nodes and connection points to and from crucial areas. Next slide. We utilize site-specific research and community-focused input through charrettes and pop-ups to influence these guiding principles. And pretty much essentially all of our design decisions were orchestrated by these 8 principles to elevate the plan to its full potential. And then, you know, the way we integrated these programs, we looked at where it was appropriate based on connections and proximity to interests like downtowns or existing community sets there. And as previously noted, the contaminated areas that really paved the way for landscape intervention with reinforcement from the other disciplines like environmental, transportation, geotechnical, and site civil engineers. We also use this as an opportunity to really enhance and elevate the user connection to the city's asset, which is the Connecticut River.
Okay, so starting in the heart of Middletown, we focused on developing complete streets. This was a big talking point for our team and the engineers here at Langen because it was proposed alternative methods of travel to the public. And this was done by enhancing the pedestrian experience, utilizing tactical urbanism, and dedicated bike lanes. And we hope that by installing these, we can cut down on personal vehicle use by the riverfront and just Main Street Middletown overall. Next. So transitioning from Main Street to the waterfront, we have the Route 9 pedestrian footbridge, which enhances the connection that passes over the highway and the rail line. The bridge implements pollinator pathways, locations for public art, seating, ADA accessibility, and that's meant to ferry the individuals enjoying the restaurants, nightlife, and everything that Main Street has to offer in order to travel to the river safely. So this encapsulates our intended goals stated in our design guidelines and gives pedestrians the opportunity to use the proposed riverfront amenities with ease. Next. So we continue from Main Street and the bridge down to these multimodal pathways that bring you to numerous green spaces along the riverfront. We envisioned open spaces with integrative native plantings for pollinator pathways, interventions for sustainable, resilient, and durable riverfront. And lastly, gathering locations such as the pavilion, which gives spaces to educate the public about native habitats while being in the midst of one. So we have a lot of help along the way to develop these important concepts. Notably, we were assisted by our marine engineers and transportation team on this one. Next. Thank you. So with the help of our guiding principles and our wonderful team, we were able to design multi-resident living connected by a large network of pedestrian-first pathways, dotted with community parks and green spaces. And of course, all of these developments would be handled while being mindful of the waterfront, properly intervening and stabilizing where needed, and remediating contaminated sites. And lastly, we just want to address master planning connection and the future. So it's important to bring people to these sites and provide an element of education to really get the visitors to understand their roles as environmental stewards and try to inspire future innovation here in Middletown and beyond. This project wasn't just meant to connect sidewalks and make the river a little less contaminated. It was to find a way to bring people together and bring them as a community closer to their environment, which is important to me because I was actually a Middletown native.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fun, rapid. All right. So I'm a senior associate. My name is Brian. I'm a senior associate at Stimson Landscape Architects, and I'm excited to share an update onto a conversation that began at the last ASLA conference. So what I want to share with you is a story about a potential 40 million acre opportunity, roughly the size of New England, all in all. And it's all about finding a sustainable, convenient lawn alternative. I do believe the general public is searching for this. They're ready. I knew it the day that my dad sent me an article from the Washington Post about no mow May and people converting their lawns. I was like, yep, the world is ready. And so I think as an alternative, we understand the benefits of meadows and their ability to provide biodiversity, mitigate water use, fertilization use, and yet still there are some barriers. And even through practice, we've seen across residential as well as institutional projects that there are challenges with seeding a meadow. It's not easy work. And then on the flip side, in terms of potted perennials and plants, there are cost limitations, and oftentimes that becomes a barrier. Next, please. So I want to share a new tool, and I think this will transform the way that all of you start to think about meadow establishment. This tool is very similar to sod, so just the way that you would roll out turf grass in order to immediately cover the surface. It has the same benefits. It provides immediate erosion control. It provides an immediate effect. And the only difference with what I'm proposing really is the species composition. So instead of relying on the 3 traditional cool season grasses that make up most of the 40 million acres of lawn across the US, let's start taking a look at native grasses and forbs. Next, please. So this is a market that is currently growing in the UK, but at the moment, it's critical to reevaluate and ensure that the species that we're utilizing in New England are well adapted here, and that they start to serve the pollinators, both the generalist as well as the specialist species that are currently here. Next, please. And so I'm excited to share trials are coming this fall. So for now, this is just a conceptual diagram, but come this fall, there will be actual images. So we're currently experimenting with a range of mixes that address cool season blends as well as warm season blends, different colors, as well as species that are adapted to specific environments. And the whole key part of this puzzle really is the use of compost as a growing media. So we're actually taking diverting food waste, turning it into compost and utilizing it locally to produce this product. Next, please. And so besides there are a couple ways that I wanted to share. There are three ways that I plan on evaluating the sustainability and ability to mitigate climate action here. First and foremost, the most important being accessibility. we have to be honest, what can on a broader public scale people access? And it comes down to price. It comes, sod, yes, will be more expensive than seed always, but you have the assurance that it will succeed. And then when you look at containerized plants, they're usually twice the cost, or even considering the environmental cost, all the plastic and dependence on peat has an environmental burden. Next, please. So the second measure is evaluating carbon sequestration. And we often consider about trees and woody mass, but I think we should take a closer look at meadows and their ability to store carbon directly into the soil. The annual growth and regrowth is a very effective carbon sink. And on top of that, we are growing on top of compost, which is also embedding carbon directly into the soil. So there are a lot of tools there, as well as water use, a very critical one. Instead of irrigating lawns, we can have drought-tolerant plants on a broader scale. Next, please. And then the third, and I'll end with this, there's some great research that Susanna Lerman and Joanne Mellon did a couple of years past evaluating bee abundance in suburban lawns. The next step to that really, I believe, would be to start evaluating this meadow sod installed and assess both the diversity as well as the abundance of pollinator species that are attracted. If you want to get involved in the trials, follow more at boldmeadows.com. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me and hosting me today. My name is David Meshulam. I am Executive Director here at Speak for the Trees Boston. We are an environmental justice tree equity nonprofit. And thank you, Liz, our board chair, Liz Luclose, for inviting me here. I have a slightly probably different tool to share with you all. It's called Tree Equity Score. And there are actually two tools here. One's called the Tree Equity Score Explorer, and the other one is called the Analyzer. And I will share with you what I mean by tree equity and how you might be able to use this tool to do your work, but also community engagement and better understanding where trees might have the deepest impact in your community. So, next slide. So what is tree equity exactly? Well, trees, as we know, are really important, and I know I'm preaching the choir here, to develop climate resilience, to provide economic, social, and public health benefits, but they're not equitably distributed due to a history of redlining, systemic racism, disinvestment in certain communities. So what we try to do at our organization is bring trees to neighborhoods where they're most needed. And we rely on several tools for that. One of them being the tool developed by American Forests called the Tree Equity Score. And next slide. So what is the Tree Equity Score? Well, I'm not a statistician, but it's all explained on their website. Essentially, every census block across the country receives a score from 0 to 100 that's normalized within that municipality. That provides a sense of where trees which census blocks trees are most needed. And that takes into account not only tree canopy coverage, but environmental factors such as temperature and air pollution, local health metrics, and also demographics. So poverty, communities of color, age, so both elderly and young people. So those populations that tend to be most susceptible to things like extreme heat. So these are the metrics that are used. Existing tree canopy, population density, income, employment, surface temperature, race, age, and health. And every census block receives a score from 0 to 100. The lower the score, the greater the priority there is for tree planting. And a score of 100 means that the neighborhood has met tree planting goals. This is meant as a tool not to compare between municipalities. So you can't compare, for instance, Brookline to Boston. A score of 60 in Brookline means something very different than a score of 60 in Boston. But it's meant to be a tool within a municipality. So for all of you who live outside of 3 very special cities that I'll explain in the next slide, there is a tool called the Tree Equity Score. It's a national explorer. The link is down there. I can drop it in the chat window as well. And every municipality in the city, in the country, in every census block, or I should say almost every census block, receives a score. You can click on that score. I took the example of Detroit here. That block right there that has a score of 52, you look to the left and you can see how it ranks. It ranks 853rd out of 875 block groups in Detroit. You can see the reasons why. The canopy goal is 48%, but it currently only has a canopy coverage of 14%. Every major city in the country has it where there's enough data. This is all data taken from the census and from remote things like satellite data. Now, if you're lucky and you live in one of 3 cities, there is this really powerful tool called the Tree Equity Score Analyzer that allows you to actually do scenario planning. So this is our rare American chestnut. And the 3 cities that are rare American chestnuts are Providence, Boston, and Richmond, Virginia. If you live outside those 3 cities, hopefully American Forests will be developing a TESA for your community. This is data that goes all the way down to the parcel level. You can actually zoom in on parcels, see where the trees are, and you can create scenarios where you're actually planting trees, and the program will spit out for you the value and the benefits of those trees. Next slide. So the differences here, real brief. Oh, the font got all funky. The Tree Equity Score is available to everyone. It provides data only on the census block level. For TESA, it's all the way down to the parcel level. Tree Equity Score Explorer is a static tool versus the Analyzer is a dynamic tool where you can actually create scenarios. You can create different scenarios that are actually shareable. And they're both tools, though, that are meant to be educational and advocacy oriented. So I think that's all I have. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions offline.
Thank you, David. Yes, these are quick, but I love seeing the things in the chat. Keep it going. And now to Vermont.
Thank you, Patricia O'Donnell here and Gregory DeVries. I'm going to do the lightning talk because we thought a short talk, you only need 1 speaker, but Greg is just back from the field actually working with the planting of the silvopasture example. So we have had the benefit of 24 years of work with Shelburne Farms. The vectors of that work have changed over time, and at the moment they have embraced a drawdown at Earth Day 2028. So that may be the shortest time frame that we've seen about where these targets are going. They're looking at every aspect of the 1,400 acre national historic landmark that is Shelburne Farms, about conserving energy to be more efficient, completing a transition to renewables, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the livestock aspect of their Swiss brown cow cheese making endeavors, and to increase carbon sequestration in fields and forests. Their goal for this year was by Earth Day to reach $1 million climate fund, which I believe they achieved. I haven't seen the update, but the conservation aspects are efficient buildings and machinery. They've shifted to electric vehicles. The transition is solar energy, heat pumps. We're going to speak specifically about the solar field. The reduction in livestock greenhouse gases is about biochar, which you see on the left. Marshall Webb, who initiated the whole issue of biochar, and then a delivery this week of biochar to the former manure pond site, and then sequestering in soil, in trees, and basically incorporating it in all aspects of grass-based farming. Next, please. So how do you put a very large solar field on a national historic landmark? This is the view from the lake, aerial back, and the yellow arrow shows where we actually put that solar field. Next, please. So two views of the solar field. At the bottom right is the first array, and the top right is the full array today. It's 4 acres, it's 1,000 panels. It covers 75% of the use of the dairy, the inn, and the campus operations. So they're well on their way in terms of that vector toward 100%, but they haven't captured all the aspects of the site because they have, I think, 40 plus buildings, and many of their staff are housed on site, so there's more to go. But what were the issues for us? Important aspects of finding out where to put this solar field and have it work, have it be accessible, but also, as you see in the next frame, have it be an educational asset. So here we are at the little shed that covers some of the machinery, and it has informational materials, and there are constantly visitors here, either those walking on the path or those who come in school groups or in groups of educators. And you will note that in their climate materials on their website, which you should all go look and see, there are 6 short videos. And at the end of each, they say, education is our most important crop. Next, please. So we have been doing a lot of tree planting, and there are planning processes that go into this. This is just a snip from a Zoom meeting last year where we were working with Interlaced Commons on planning for silvopasture, and the 2 circles on the right are evergreen groves that were placed there by the Webbs and are historic, and they've lost some trees, and the farm has been clearing out the invasives, particularly the European buckthorn and the Japanese honeysuckle, to open those areas so that they are partially shaded pasture areas. So there are 2 ways to go about silvopasture. Silvopasture is actually a process of bringing 35 to 40% shade into pasture areas. It is better for carbon sequestration. It's better for the livestock health and well-being, and with rising temperatures, it's an increasing technique. Drawdown actually lists it as one of their top interventions for improving carbon drawdown and greenhouse gas. So moving on, next frame. This is the area we have focused on. On the left, you find the 1942 aerial view that shows that there were some trees here. You also see the roads. This is also where the walking path brings you in from the visitor center to explore this property, and the area that we've got marked off in Google Earth is the area where the new silvopasture trees are going. Pastures with trees sequester 5 to 10 times as much carbon as pastures without trees, and with rising temperatures, this is a very important demonstration, because Shelburne Farms is all about education. They will bring together farmers and the farm community to see how this silvopasture work is going. Now, as landscape architects and preservationists, here we are planting in an area that was open historically. We are always looking at the ways in which historic properties can become more effective and more vital in contemporary life. This would be under a rehabilitation treatment where we are responding to contemporary needs and not upsetting the overall character and presentation of the landscape as we integrate silvopasture more inclusively, more completely into Shelburne Farms. Shelburne Farms, while being a National Historic Landmark, is really all about education for sustainability into the future. So they're not, they are always interested in innovation and moving. Next frame. And in closing, we would just say that there are many climate benefits, and at the same time, we can renew the historic landscape character by working with tree renewal. And we have been working with them for 20 years on annual aspects of tree renewal. We would just point out here on the upper left, the bare root trees we've had very good success from, because we have ease of transportation, less fuel costs in moving trees from nursery to location, and the trees settle in better because they're not two different types of soil, and there's less root loss and less breakage of the fine root mass. While we understand that these are bagged in plastic, they are gel dipped so that they can be held for a few days and kept moist and then planted. So I would just refer you to Shelburne Farms website to look at their comprehensive carbon drawdown initiatives and climate action through the next 5 years to get to zero. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name's Ian Ramey. I'm a principal with Copley Wolf in Boston. It's great to be here participating in the summit, and thanks to all our local chapters for organizing this event. Today, I'm going to quickly talk about the MARC at De Normandy Wharf in East Boston, otherwise known as the former Hodge Boiler Works site. I think this is a good example of how private developer and profit-driven projects can take more of a leading role in climate action, and how we as landscape architects can kind of help to direct that effort for the better. If we could go to the next slide. So needless to say, East Boston's waterfront for a long time has been a heavily industrialized condition. A lot of maritime operations happened here over the past 200 years. And then with that industry going away, a lot of those waterfront parcels were kind of left in fallow post-industrial contaminated conditions. You can see on the bottom slides the conditions of the site that we were working with when we first started, essentially a barren and inaccessible site that no one could get to, right on the water's edge. If you go to the next slide. So this brings us to our site planning context. Really, this story is about reconnecting and bringing viable use back to the waterfront. So this project delivers 107 units of housing and completes one of the last segments of the East Boston Harbor Walk, which is part of a greater 43-mile linear park, essentially, that links East Boston to Dorchester. The site plan here delivers 2/3 of the site as publicly accessible open space, with the bulk of that open space being concentrated on the waterfront and on the Harbor Walk. The primary resiliency move here is the elevation of the habitable floors to be well above the 2070 projected flood elevations, and also pushing the building as far from the water as possible to still fit the program, and then to sink the garage below grade and to cover that with a vegetated open space. The resiliency measure in the elevation lands us approximately 7 feet higher than the adjacent grades in the existing Harbor Walk. I think one of our big challenges here from a design perspective was finding ways to manage that 7 feet of grade change in a clever and accessible way. And I think the way we did that is to introduce the idea of a planted bluff, essentially. That planted bluff is a condition where we tried to bring accessible interventions and to have the bluff be broken into a series of smaller steps so that it didn't feel as insurmountable. And within those steps to introduce programmable elements like a stage, amphitheater seating, moments of pause along the accessible route. And then at the top of that grade change at the first floor level, really got into a public open space that's programmable and active to bring people to the water's edge. If you go to the next slide. So hand sketching is a big part of our process at Copley Wolf. Another part of the project, in addition to just the resiliency, was really about reconnecting and enriching that harbor walk experience. We're trying to get a lot of different types of activation and subspaces along this stretch. It's about a 200-foot linear connection between the existing portions of the harbor walk. I think the sketch gives you an indication of some of the different types of activity that we're trying to integrate into this space. If you go to the next slide. So the next series really gets at the condition of the harbor walk. Intentionally, what we have here is a harbor walk that is different from the adjacent harbor walks, which are much more rectilinear and paved with concrete and other types of materials. What we wanted to do here was really make that harbor walk sway a bit more, be more organic, introduce a lot more planting, and have it be a softer kind of condition, something as we see as a welcome contrast to that kind of more built out hard edge of the adjacent sites. Next slide. Wayfinding interpretation is obviously really important to get people engaged with the waterfront. So the idea of having wayfinding markers that tell you where you are along this entire stretch of open space of the harbor walk. And then because there is a rich maritime history about things like the Hodge Boiler Works, moments along the harbor walk where there's interpretation to get people interested in the past use of the site, and then to see sort of in contrast what it's become now. Next slide. And then here's just some details of the different subspaces that we create, introducing native vegetation to create these subspaces. Obviously, tremendous views to be taken advantage of, and a lot of different types of activity that comes across the site in terms of walking, biking, that type of thing. Next slide. And then this is a sketch that shows the idea of how that bluff is broken down, that grade change is sort of segmented into different pieces. You get a sense of the idea of the tiering of the native vegetation. I think one of the things that we've noted here is that some people observe this planting as being wild and kind of unkempt. We think that there should be more of this. There should be more of this native palette. It's native to Suffolk County. It's also cross-selected for coastal conditions. There's more than 40 different species of plants here. It's really something that may look a little wild, but is quite organized, and something that we think we want to see more of along the water's edge if possible. Next slide. And then just another detail of how that accessible route that brings you up to that elevated resilient level is nestled into the planting on both sides. Next slide. And here's a shot of the upper terrace. Again, all publicly accessible. There's a shade arbor, as you see in the foreground, with fixed seating. There's also a public amenity deck that overlooks on the water and will serve a planned restaurant use, part of the water-dependent use that the project is required to deliver. And next slide. And then just some dust shots looking back at the harbor walk from the adjacent property, as well as the amphitheater and stage element that make up that grade change. So I think, just in summary here, I would say that this project is a good example of how we as landscape architects can work with private developers to do more. I think we need to recognize that there are partners. They are the catalysts and activists of a lot of the development that has to happen in the city. And I also hope that through the new administration in the city and some of the recent actions we've seen, that they continue to push developers to take a more resilient approach, and that that'll sort of elevate our role as landscape architects to help them realize that vision and do a better job overall. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Jessica Walla. I'm a civil engineer in the Resilient Planning and Design Group at Niche, so Niche Engineering. So thanks for letting me crash your summit. So at Niche, we've worked with a number of agencies in securing grant funding, preparing MVP plans, hazard mitigation plans, developing stormwater regulations and ordinances, and designing sustainable and resilient stormwater solutions. So today I'm going to focus on a green infrastructure retrofit project down in Braintree at the Smith Beach parking lot. So I had the pleasure of working with a very savvy client here. They were able to secure state and federal funding for a number of stormwater projects. So these projects, they focused on improving water quality at the Weymouth Fort River and preparing for the rising tides, increased storm precipitation that we're going to see. So we can stay on this slide. First, we worked with the town to do a grant-funded watershed study, and the purpose here was to identify potential sites within the town to manage stormwater. And we ranked these sites based off the biggest bang for the buck. So basically, which sites and projects could manage the largest, sturdiest watersheds and drainage areas before they discharge to the river. Next, Braintree secured state funding via the MVP Action Grant to actually design the Smith Beach parking lot retrofit project. So that's the second bullet there. And I've also listed a few other grants the town secured to start the design of additional projects out of that watershed study. So they've been really great with that funding. Next slide. So this parking lot, it was identified as a top priority because of where it sits at the bottom of a drainage area. And the outlet from this parking lot goes directly to the river. You can see the beach right across this Vinedale Road there. Next slide. So as part of the study, we identified the drainage area and the watershed area that we could collect at this parking lot. And from there, we quantified the pollutants that we could remove using green infrastructure. There was a particular focus here on pathogen bacteria, as well as sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen. So next slide. We designed a deep porous pavement section here in combination with fire retention filters and open space and tree canopy. And we actually designed the system to manage almost 5 inches of stormwater, which far exceeds any local or state regulations. And it actually lines up with projected future storm events and recommendations that we got when we ran the state RMAT tool that Catherine had discussed earlier. Next slide. We also used the state coastal flood risk model, also referred to as MC-FERN, to design the system and to understand sea level rise through the project life cycle, so through about 2050, and storm surge events through the 100-year storm event. So you can see on the left is a map of what the parking lot would see in the 100-year storm event in 2050. And then on the right is just the mean high water with sea level rise up to 5 feet. So we considered these elevations when we designed the system and basically wanted to prevent flow from the river from entering into our system. It's a tidal river, so prevent that water from entering into our system and kind of preserving that storage volume that we designed for it, stormwater coming down the hill, as opposed to just allowing that water to backflow in. So we designed our pipe network taking into account elevations in 2050. Next slide. We use that RMAT tool as an example of the output that Catherine had spoken about. So we use this to actually inform our design goals. Because of this tool, we've, based off the lifespan, the critical nature or not so critical nature of a parking lot, we decided the 5-year 2050 storm event was our goal. So we designed that system as best we could. It's not a regulatory goal, but just keeping that goal in mind. Next slide. Cool. So I think major takeaways would be thinking about a lot of your projects may have similar opportunities where you may be in a good point in a watershed or a drainage area, or you might be coastal. So thinking about opportunities, I've listed a few here, everything from flood mitigation, water quality treatment, shoreline restoration, thinking about ways to incorporate that into your design, not only to improve water bodies, improve our stress infrastructure, prepare for the future, but also to open your project up to grant funding. Our experience has been the state is very eager and helpful in distributing this money. And there really are a lot of opportunities out there.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm Jill DeSimone. I'm a landscape architect and also program director for the Landscape Architecture program at the University of Connecticut. I live in Massachusetts, so I'm a member of both the Connecticut and the Massachusetts chapter, or Boston chapter. So it's great. Thank you for organizing this. Next slide. I wear a lot of hats, and so I wasn't sure what to talk about, but I decided to talk about the fellowship program that I'm involved with, just to get the word out about the people and projects that we supported, but also to connect with others interested in this type of work and climate justice work. Next. Also in kind of collaborations and using our skills to work with other disciplines, in this case with data science, and to kind of build communities, support advocates, climate justice advocates and public servants doing work where they're doing work. And so to me, the action here is really to create a community to support advocacy and grounded work and to build accessible tools that help people promote equity and justice in their communities. Next. So with this talk, I can't really do anything justice. I'm actually not going to explain anything. I'm just trying to kind of pique the interest and to sort of showcase what we were able to do with our pilot project, which was in support 7 incredible individuals and projects. I want to spread the word about that work. I can't really speak on their behalf. I'm not trying to speak on their behalf or even do kind of the work justice. I just want to consider this a teaser and to invite you to visit all of these portals and websites that we developed. Next. And so I'm going to say one word around each project. This is the project done by Jerisha Brannon, who's a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, who wanted to relate environmental justice indicators to the lived experiences of communities of color, especially surrounding the heat dome and the heat dome project. Heat Dome in Portland, Oregon, relating canopy indicators to people's stories, so a storytelling effort. She collaborated with a number of groups, including the county and other local nonprofits, to kind of make data relatable and to give its ownership to the community through storytelling. Next, sorry. Yeah, it's hard not to get too excited about the work, so I'm going to try to be brief. So Carlos Clausel is a climate justice advocate based in Philadelphia, and he wanted to look at the concept of blue lining, which is when banks and other lenders draw lines of risk around certain neighborhoods based on their susceptibility, in this case to flooding or other climate-related issues. He's working towards a map, but kind of thinking about how this framework could be developed by and for the communities of color that live in these particular places. Next. Laura Robinson's actually the only landscape designer. She's in Maryland, working for not-for-profit design firm there and very committed to schools. So working on a tool for the Prince George's County School to fight for climate adapted school landscapes and increase kind of canopy on their schoolyards. All of these projects were supported by mentors, who I'll show you in the end, but this was supported by Pamela Conrad and others. Next. Dominique Thomas is a organizer in Harlem. Her day job is to look at kind of toxicity and toxic materials, but she wanted to create a portal to look at health equity impacts and climate justice through an Afrofuturist and Black ecological thought perspective. And so she developed this amazing portal with walking tours, organizing curriculums, as well as maps and data. Next. Jax Tran is a trauma-informed social worker in running a great organization in New Orleans, interested in the Asian American diaspora stories in New Orleans and the Gulf South. So creating a storytelling and data equity project that aims to capture some of those experiences and use the work that she does to kind of bring these stories to light. She's a really amazing individual. She talks about it beautifully. So I encourage you, I'll post some resources at the end of things that we recorded during the fellowship. Next. So Ydamas Vaquero is a lawyer in Los Angeles advocating for legislation around toxicity and hazardous waste cleanup at schools. In fact, that they don't have legislation around charter schools when a charter school is proposed on a formerly contaminated site. So really developing these data tools to support that legislative change. Next. And lastly, Alexa White is an ecologist, kind of critically evaluating EJ screening tools that we've become so familiar with and that it can enable some of our work, but to think about the cumulative impacts rather than telling stories site by site or disaster by disaster and working towards a kind of paper to relate these issues. Next. As I mentioned, it's really a community building project, and all of the work of the fellows was supported by mentors, again, including Pamela Conrad for Laura's project and someone from American Forest that developed the tree equity and analyzer tools that David showed for Jarisha's project, among others. So we really tried to pair kind of experts and kind of issues around the work that the fellows were doing. Next. It's a team effort, so I co-directed the project with a data scientist named Nathan Sanders and was supported very much by Sophie Weston-Chen and Diana Go, as well as consultants. So Jonathan Foster doing some data analysis and visualization, Bruce Boschek helping us with GIS, and a couple of web consultancy firms that do work around equity and internet and tech tools. So that was amazing. Next. The pilot project was supported by a number of institutions, especially at Harvard University, where we originally launched the project. So a call out to them for with whom this wouldn't be possible, as well as Data Commons, which is a project of Google trying to get data tools out there to be able to visualize and relate some of these climate issues together in an accessible format. All right, next. Okay, so thank you. These are some resources. The website is the dashboard I showed at the beginning, which aggregates all of the projects. We haven't been super active on Twitter and Instagram lately, but you can visit the sites. We have a YouTube where we recorded some of the content with the fellowship, and feel free to send us a note via Gmail if you're interested in hearing more about the work or collaborating in some capacity. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the ASLA for organizing this wonderful event. Next slide, please. So my name is John Brownecant, and I'm a public space planner for the city of Somerville. And I'm going to talk with you about green infrastructure within our open spaces, how we adopt green infrastructure, collect quantitative data about this green infrastructure, and then how we can report this to the residents of the city of Somerville. Next slide, please. So the city of Somerville has more than 160 acres of public open space throughout it. With the city of Somerville being one of the densest cities in the area, we need to utilize our parks and open space to incorporate green infrastructure into these parks, making them more of a multifunctional landscape. Next slide, please. So some of the green infrastructure practices in use in the city include porous pavement, infiltration chambers, and stormwater systems for irrigation. You can see a list below of the different parks that we have incorporated these types of green infrastructure in. Next slide, please. And then a few other practices of green infrastructure include rain gardens, sand filters, and tree wells, which we have also adopted within our city in different parks and open spaces. Next slide, please. So now that we have this green infrastructure installed in our newly renovated parks, what's next? So we started to update our parks data spreadsheet, which is a list of all different factors and information about each park. We created 2 new sections into the spreadsheet. 1, does the park have or capture stormwater? And then 2, if so, what are the green infrastructure practices being used at the park or open space? So here you can kind of see a list of some of the green infrastructure practices that we captured in a few of our different parks throughout the city, just kind of listing a little description of all the different green infrastructure. Next slide, please. So now that we've determined which parks have green infrastructure within them, we can then start to quantify the amount of storage and impacts these green infrastructure practices have. Here on the left, you can see a template of the data we're trying to collect, listing all the different types of green infrastructure we have within our parks and open spaces. And then on the right-hand side, you can see an example of the green infrastructure quantities within Lincoln Park in Somerville. Between the infiltration chambers, the rainwater harvesting cistern, and the rain gardens, a total of more than 180,000 cubic feet of stormwater can be captured on the site. Next slide, please. So we've also implemented a green score rating within the city's zoning to help push residences and private developments to implement green infrastructure within their properties. On top of that, we also have a native plant ordinance that grants bonus points to the green score ratings for use of native plant species on their properties. So now that we have all this data, what do we do with it? So far, the city of Somerville is working to populate our parks and open spaces with signs and information about the multifunctional landscape and the impacts these green infrastructure is having on the parks. We're also working to update the green infrastructure website on the city's site, making this information more readily available and easier for the residents to understand these systems and the benefits that these systems give us. Next slide, please. And so future goals, we also want to push this data a little bit further. So our idea is to kind of make a comprehensive map of the green infrastructure within our parks and open spaces, but also combine it with what the engineering department has collected on green infrastructure within our rights of ways, and kind of create an interactive map where users could click on a park and see the outlines of the different infiltration basins and rain gardens and other green infrastructure within that park, and kind of gather some more information about the quantities these hold and the different benefits that they have, because a lot of this green infrastructure can be buried and the public doesn't really know about it. We also would love to have this data, sorry, you can just stay back on that. Thank you. We also would love to have this data compiled with our parks construction and maintenance costs to be able to better estimate the cost of green infrastructure installation at future parks, and to kind of help us determine which green infrastructure practices would work for different types of parks and open spaces. So I'm happy to discuss this further if anyone is interested. I can drop my email in the chat and would love to talk about this more. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Bukili from the city of Somerville. Next slide. I'm the Senior Urban Forestry and Landscape Planner, and I'm going to talk to you today about trees in Somerville and some policies we have to increase canopy cover. Next slide, please. So in 2021, the city completed an urban forest management plan that looks at all the trees in the city. And as part of that study, we did a land use assessment from aerial imagery from 2018. And we found that we have 14.6% canopy cover in Somerville, as shown in the dark green in this map here. And our goal is to increase canopy cover to 16%. And this is based on what's physically possible, socially preferable, and realistic. Next slide, please. We have a tree inventory of all of the publicly owned trees in the city, and that shows that we have over 13,000 trees on public property, including street trees, park trees, and then state land. We have land that DCR owns and some MBTA land and Mass DOT. You can find our inventory on this website. Thank you. Our canopy analysis, though, includes all the trees on public property as well as private property. And in the city, about 2/3 of our land is privately owned, and equivalently about 2/3 of our tree canopy is on private property. So we need to consider trees on private property as well as public property when we're trying to increase canopy cover. Next slide, please. How do we increase canopy cover? Well, there's two main ways we can do it. We can plant more trees, and we can protect and maintain the trees we have so that they grow bigger. And as I mentioned before, we need to think about this on both public and private property. Next slide. So for public property, I'm in charge of our tree planting program, and we are working towards planting more trees every year. About a decade ago, we were planting an average of 50 or 60 trees per year, and that's been increasing over time, and now we're meeting our goal of planting at least 350 trees per year. That's what my division does. We also tend to plant more trees when we have capital projects or parks projects going on. Those don't get in they're additional above and beyond the 350. And when we think about tree planting, we not only need to think about just planting more trees in the ground, but planting the right tree in the right place, using the right planting method, and having the right tree care after the trees are planted. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned before, private property is also a big piece of the puzzle here. So we have a few different mechanisms for trying to limit canopy reduction and increase tree canopy over time on private property. One of those mechanisms is our private tree removal permit process, which is a new process that came from our tree preservation ordinance. So basically, if someone wants to remove a healthy, non-invasive tree that's over 8 inches in diameter from private property, then they need a permit to do that. And in most cases, they're required to either replant trees, an equivalent number of trees that meets the number of caliper inches that are being removed, or pay an in lieu payment into our tree fund so that the city can arrange to plant trees, more trees. And just as an example, in the last few years, we issued tree permits to remove about 200, sorry, this is relevant to the previous slide, to remove approximately 250 trees. And with that, there was expectations to plant 375 trees, and we also got about $150,000 in our tree fund for the city to arrange planting. Okay, next slide, thank you. The other mechanism that we have to encourage the growth of tree canopy on private property is through our zoning code. Our new zoning code requires all new development properties and properties undergoing substantial renovation to meet green score requirements. Green score is an environmental performance standard for landscaping, and it provides a toolbox or menu of options to incentivize urban landscapes that to better manage stormwater, filter pollutants, reduce heat island, and all the other environmental benefits that landscapes provide. The landscape elements are divided into 5 different categories: soil, ground cover, plants, trees, and then engineered landscapes like green roofs, rain gardens, and vegetated walls. In this green score, trees are given a particularly high weight for the calculation, so it encourages people to preserve existing trees and to plant new canopy tree species. And we also give bonus credits for planting native species and high value species that help wildlife. And next slide, please. That was a lot to cover in a short time, so I have some links here if you'd like to know more, and you can contact the urban forestry team at trees@somervillema.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I will just briefly note that I know we're at 2 o'clock. We've got 3 more lightning speakers left. And just very brief wrap up moment. So we've got about 15 minutes left together for those who can stay. We really appreciate you being here. This is awesome. Kate, please take it away.
Thanks, Gretchen. This is Kate Kennan from Offshoots, the landscape architect. And next slide. And I'm here to talk about Hood Bike Park, which is a half-acre park that was recently completed in 2021. And one of the main resiliency, this is in Charlestown, Mass. And one of the main resiliency objectives here was to get above the 2070 base sea level rise. This is all in the floodplain. So this was lifted about 4 feet above the base sea level rise. And then next slide. But the real kind of exciting thing about this project is the productive horticulture that's with it. So the upper level of the roof deck is an air pollution buffer from the highway behind, the elevated highway and the tracks behind. Next slide. And what you can see here is these highways generate air particulate matter that we know has, through a lot of the studies at Tufts and other places that we know has a real impact on human health. And so we have the air particulate matter coming in, and by raising these phytoremediation species in the air, we can help actually capture that and cleanse it, mitigate it. And then also we planted deep into the groundwater plane with what we call phreatophyte trees that are basically living wells to try to clean up the contaminated groundwater plane below as well. Next slide. So what we did first was really map the contamination on site. You can see 93 has this 200-meter zone, air particulate matter zone, where our site crossed between, and we also mapped all of the contaminated groundwater wells and mapped where the groundwater was moving on site. Next slide. And then using that data, what we were able to do is position those plants to maximize their input. So on the top of this pavilion is these, what we call the coastal ledge. So it's plants that have stickier, waxier leaves with more leaf hairs and more stomata. So there are groups of trees that will take up these particulate matter pollutants more than others, and they've actually captured them on their leaves. So this is a variety of aspens, it's got bayberry, it's got Junipers virginiana, and then the wet thicket down below targets the groundwater pollution mitigation with hybrid poplar, willows, and other Cornus species. Next slide. This is all sort of the phytoremediation layer is layered on top of other horticultural productive landscape ideas. The idea here of 90% of it being native. So we actually looked at not only cultivars that are often very sterile, but looked at trying to replenish the native seed bank by thinking about straight species and also some of the cultivars that would still mix and spread by seed. Next slide, please. And so each of these communities was named and modeled after kind of native plant communities. The plants are not only for, you know, the ecological connections, but also people, and really thinking about a tight color chart to engage the community. Next slide. And the plant materials are all kind of framed by a really clean line so that these messier, again, the plantings, or what some people would consider messy, are a little bit more accepted. And then we really used a couple non-natives that we decided to put in there for key interest in color and spreading around. Next slide, please. The last thing is, horticulture is sort of a thing we love to do at offshoots, and being in the field, we actually do the planting since it's a living system. And what's exciting about this project is we really went to 5 or so different nurseries for many of the plant species. So we would have diversity in the gene pool. So we want them to breed with each other and spread seeds. So important piece for climate adaptation. Next slide. And yeah, that's it. Basically, we're excited about kind of pushing the profession to have this more productive horticulture that really overlaps phytoremediation, ecological connection, native species, you know, seed dispersal, people in place. Thanks.
Hi, thank you everyone for this amazing talk and coordination. Thanks, Gretchen. Hello, my name is Li Wei Shen, and I am a landscape designer at Sasaki. And so I graduated from the GSD last year. So glad to see you again, Jill and Matthew, my previous professors. Next slide. I will present my graduate thesis today, The Echoes of Sky River. Next slide. It delves into the Sky River theory, which describes the water vapor in the atmosphere as filamentary structures akin to rivers and watersheds. This global network of water exporters and receivers form beyond the geological boundaries, extending the ground hydrological territory and linking distant spaces. Next slide. To utilize the resource, essential techniques are applied to increase the rainfall, which creates a highly monitored and politicized systems in the sky. For example, the aircraft is to generate rain in 8 hours through the water controlling, monitoring, and forecasting systems. The research focuses on the Sky River in northwestern China. The influence of weather manipulation technology can be seen in huge patches aiming to secure agricultural production and promote ecological preservation. It also shows catalysts that create widespread overcast and precipitation depending on the meteorological conditions. In this animation, we can see the sky like 5 kilometers above the land and transformed by the cloud seeding operations and resulting in the creation of various types of clouds. As the prevailing winds carry along these clouds and their accompanying catalyst, they serve as a conduit for connecting different social systems across vast distances. It's okay, probably next slide. One of the sites I have studied has Uyghur people who migrate through seasonal pasturelands and hold transitional festivals each time they relocate. During the festival, they build a structure with stones and wood, releasing smokes to show their appreciation to the sky, which increases the concentration in clay and increases the chance of rain. The traditional rainmaking structure is similar to the modern cloud seeding stove. The different interpretations of causality creates an aesthetic ambiguity. I propose that the landscape architecture can use hybrid spatial coexistence for cultural conservation and territorial connection to invoke a distant MC and construct a techno-cultural alliance. This section is showing how the Sky River is brought to life on the ground through the use of cloud seeding infrastructures. During the festival periods, these structures are activated and become a cultural celebration for local people. This thesis believes that the climate change at first to be a local and a weather problem that tightly bonds to the local cosmologies of the collectivities, then become a global issue that calls for cultural empathy. This project proposes that landscape as a hybrid medium and creates a decentralized network of the reciprocal infrastructure of water resources. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Matthew Cunningham. I'm founding principal of MCLD. We create contextual, ecologically sincere residential landscapes throughout New England. I'm also a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I introduce the next generation of landscape architects about the invaluable medium of plants and the act of placemaking. Next slide, please. Conversations about climate change and resiliency and adaptation often focus on municipal and institutional responses, but we must consider all forms and scales of practice in order to make meaningful impacts that address challenges ahead for everyone. Last year, in Lightning Round, I spoke about the cumulative impacts of residential landscape architecture related to topics such as carbon sequestration, stormwater management, increasing habitat and biodiversity, supporting air and water quality, water conservation, shaping character of place, et cetera. I spend a lot of time observing the weather. These are a series of 4 iPhone screenshots showing Hurricane Ida as it quickly intensified from the Gulf heading up the East Coast, and it showed the scale of deluge that the state of Massachusetts and much of New England experienced around September 1st in 2021. Next slide, please. If a single hurricane, in this case, Ida, can do this to buildings and infrastructure and lives, next. We have to consider what it can do to the vegetation and ecosystems that stand in the paths of destructive weather patterns, or in destructive weather patterns. Plant communities are completely under assault everywhere you look. Next slide, please. This is a slide from the National Weather Service that demonstrates the number of storms, tropical cyclones in both the Atlantic and Pacific between 1949 onward on the Pacific side and 1851 in the Atlantic to the current present day. We have to ask ourselves, what can we learn by observing destructive weather patterns that happen over an extended period of time? And we have to obviously recognize the fact that our design solutions must factor these lessons in. Next slide, please. So this year I've decided to give a quick chat about a site-specific approach that we employed that demonstrates a stormwater management approach at a residential project our firm did on the coast of Maine called the Petite Chalet. It was built in 2009 and it received an ASLA award in 2014, as well as a BSLA award in 2012. Next, please. In 2008, Hurricane Hannah was zipping up the eastern seaboard. In the end, it ended up killing over 537 people, caused at least $160 million in damage to the US coastline. And at the time that this storm was occurring, I was actively interviewing for a new residential project on the edge of Acadia National Park in Southwest Harbor, Maine. The property was in a holding pattern during construction, and there was no landscape architect involved, and the property sustained major damage during the storm. Next, please. The images on the right show the scale of destruction, the amount of sediment and erosion that happened, forcing all the topsoil into Somme Sound. Our approach involved several stages of investigation, but however, the most important part was stabilizing the site prior to winter. Next, please. Our solution involved a significant number of stormwater mitigation strategies that essentially brought the velocity of water down through the site in a series of managed mitigation channels. We have a significant 4-foot deep stormwater. Actually, next slide, please, Gretchen. We have a 4-foot deep, 2-foot wide stormwater infiltration trench that essentially captures water and disperses it throughout the site. We have a series of vegetated swales and vegetated basins that collect water and cleanse it. The other significant part of this project was that it utilized native plants and indigenous plant materials to help stabilize soils and prevent erosion, supporting habitat and development of sustainable, sorry, I just lost my screen here. Next slide, please. Okay, the massive curtain drain and infiltration trench captures water and disperses it throughout the site. We used soils to cover new landforms and used indigenous and native plant sods and ground covers throughout the site to stabilize the soils. Next, please. The native plants are used to reduce erosion. They heighten multi-seasonal drama and they enhance local ecologies throughout the property. Next, please. You can see the explosion of color that happens with species such as hay-scented fern, lowbush blueberry, bayberry, and birch and spruce. Next, please. Here we are with a colony of young birch and bayberry and sweet fern and highbush blueberry and spruce establishing themselves at this maybe a year or two out after the project was built. Next. And here you see last the brilliant sense of seasonal color that really shapes the character of place, and it really very much connects to the context of Acadia. Sorry, I rushed through that quickly, Gretchen.
That's great, Matthew. Everybody did. And I'm so grateful to you for figuratively and literally bringing us home. Actually, on that point, in the call for lightning talks, there were several different series of things that got seeded that we weren't able to do today. You know, one that will come up that we'll do in an ongoing workshop will focus on materials and products and those sorts of things, because that's all part, of course, of how we make these projects. And we'll do another one focused on students and student work, because Li Wei did an awesome job of summarizing her thesis in 3 minutes, but it really deserves a lot more time than that, as well as many other colleagues at Harvard GSD, the BAC, Northeastern, UMass, Conway. You know, there's so many schools around to include. So those events will be coming up. But to wrap us up today, I want to invite Tom and Louisa, if you're able to just say a few words. Yes, UConn, RISD, URI. I got you, Jason. Many, all of our New England schools and beyond. But Tom or Louisa, would you like to say, or please?
Of course. You know, Gretchen, I think a lot of credit is owed to you for being such a spearhead for, you know, driving this event for the second year in a row now. So thank you for that. And thank you, especially to Catherine and Pamela for, you know, offering your time today to speak to us. You know, I think we all learned a lot. And then obviously for the lightning speakers who blasted through at the end there, you know, I think more than anything, what I take away from today and had this thought several times was, you know, there's a lot of doom and gloom out there around climate change. And as we were preparing for today, we were thinking like, you know, we're in a really nice position where we're providing positive impacts and positive outcomes. And, you know, I think we need to like internally focus on the positive and also share that out to the public and to our clients that, you know, we're doing something that's an appreciating asset. And so, you know, we're doing awesome work and we need to be proud and talk about that a lot. So, you know, it's great to see the breadth of work that people do, you know, especially within this region, because that's, you know, where our focus is. But, you know, I think Louisa has some other comments and questions for us too, as we think about, you know, as we're leaving today. So I'll let her speak a little bit.
Absolutely, and I'm not sure she's able to hop on at the moment, but
is she here? I can always cover if
go for it, Tom.
All right, sure. So, you know, some of what we're talking about is what can we do? You know, what are those additional steps that we can do as practitioners? You know, coming into this is, you know, reading the climate action plan from national, and you know, so that's really, you know, we need to continue to promote that and also read it and digest it. But, you know, I think we're recognizing that that isn't the be all end all guide for us. Like we all have such unique individual firms addressing, you know, specific issues with all our clients. You know, as we were talking, Steve made a really nice comment that said, you know, the climate action plan is not about giving answers or telling us as landscape architects what we should be doing. It's a prompt for each of us to question the processes of everything we're doing within the site and the construction. I even had a conversation in one of the breakouts about, you know, someone who's just like, you know, you always topsoil and see a steep slope and then it like ostensibly rains, right, and washes it all away. And I think just thinking about everything we do within our profession and implementation, as Matthew really summarized beautifully there with his project at the end, like, are there alternative solutions that are not the norm we're used to? So I think continuing to think about that. And as Scott said on one of our early calls, just do something, right? Like it's a big kind of bulky thing to deal with climate change, how we're approaching it, how we're addressing it. But, you know, if anything, I think what we take away from today is to do something, to get involved. Tons of resources out there now. I'm sure, Gretchen, you'll send out that long list of links and resources. And so to take some time and look through that and just to continue to stay in touch with people. I think if anything, the ability to see what everyone else is doing within the state and within our New England region at all the different levels is such a huge inspiration. So thank you all and for being involved, and like, let's keep it up. Let's keep the momentum going.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Great job.
Thanks, everyone.